Likutei Sichos, Chelik Chav Zayin, volume 27, the second Sicha for Parshas Vayikra. This Sicha will explain the concept of Hidur Mitzvah, literally the beautification of a mitzvah, meaning the requirement for one to go above and beyond when it comes to the performance of a mitzvah, the procurement of the items with which one does the mitzvah, as it applies to mitzvahs in general and korbanos, offerings in particular. To familiarize ourselves with some of the concepts, so to help us flow easier through the Sicha, first of all, something which we recite every morning in the Az Yashir, it says, Zeh Keli Vanveyu. This is my God, and I will beautify him. From here, the Chazal tell us, the sages learn out in the Talmud, that he's Sno'eh Lefanav b'mitzvahs, that there's an obligation to, quote, beautify yourselves before him with a mitzvah. That means when you do a mitzvah, you go above and beyond. Also, the Rambam, that's Maimonides, his monumental halachic work is called Mishnah Torah. And it has 14 books, 14 sections. He wrote it with great precision, with great diuk, and every single thing, whether it's the order of how he presents the laws, and moreover, the expressions and the sources that he chooses to back up the laws, they're very, very telling, and they contribute to the actual understanding and the appreciation of the said dinim, the said laws, when one takes a deeper, closer look to it. Another thing to be familiar with, in all mitzvahs, there are two aspects, or perhaps you can say two varying accomplishments in the mitzvah. There is what we call the gavra. Gavra literally means the person, or the chefza, the object. That means in some mitzvahs there's more of a focus on the person performing the mitzvah, so to speak, his obligation that he needs to fulfill. And then there is the chefza, the object, the effect that the mitzvah is having on the object itself, or the thing that needs to get accomplished, as we'll see in the Sicha. So from here on, I'm going to refer to it as Gavra. Gavra is the person, Chefza is the object. Another thing to be familiar with, Tashmishe Mitzvah or Tashmishe Kedusha. Objects of a mitzvah are objects of holiness. When one does a mitzvah, one performs a mitzvah with an object, that object assumes a certain level of holiness. They're differing in degrees. Sometimes it's just to the extent that the object was used for a mitzvah. Okay, for example, just to give you my own example, the wicks which were used for Hanukkah candles, they don't become actually holy. However, since they were used as a tool for a mitzvah, it's brought on a Shulchan Aruch that one shouldn't just discard them with the regular garbage, but rather there is a means in which you should discard them in a very respectful manner. But they're not actual holy, they're not actually Tashmisha Kedusha, as let's say, for example, when one writes a mezuzah, one writes tefillin, one has a pure tzitzis, they become actually holy. Another thing to be familiar with, a korban mincha, a meal offering. In the Beis HaMikdash, there were many types of offerings. There were offerings that came from many types of animals, kosher animals. But then there was this something called a korban mincha, a meal offering, which typically, in and itself, as an offering, was offered by the poorest of the poor. Those who could not afford even a small little lamb, or even birds, as an offering, as an atonement, the Torah allows them. The Torah gives an allowance for them to make a meal offering, which basically comprised of a little fine flour and some oil, and basically nothing more than that. Which basically, how much would that cost? That's so meager and small in cost. Now, yet, even though this comes from a poor person, and even though it's so small and seemingly most least significant, yet, as we see in this week's Parsha, when the Torah refers to it, the Torah opens the subject of a korban mincha. The Torah says, "V'nefesh kisakrim," and a soul that will bring an offering, a meal offering. Why does it say a soul versus what it was, the reference that was made prior to this, when it came to all the other offerings, it spoke about a person. So the sages tell us that because this person is bringing their best, this person is so poor, and they're bringing everything they got, and they're bringing their best to Hashem, so Hashem, quote unquote, considers it as if they're offering their soul, as if they're bringing the nefesh themselves, their own very soul. Let's go into the Sikha. So in the laws of Isurei Mizbeach, the laws where the Rambam describes those things that are forbidden for the altar, in the end of chapter 7, the Rambam describes 9 different stages in the preparation of the olive oil, meaning 9 different grades, one greater than the other in the olive oil. And then he says, 3 of them are kosher for the menorah. We know that the Torah requires for the menorah the utmost pristine and pure oil, as it says, kosis lamoer. So these 3 of them would fit the bill. However, he says that all the other ones, all of them, quote, even though they are all kosher for meal offerings, they're all kosher from menachos, yet, why were all 9 levels described? Why is it necessary to know? So he says, because it's important to know the order of priority, the different levels, to know which one is more pure than the other, which one is more refined than the other. And let's put it in the Rambam's words. And if at the end of the day they're all kosher, they all suitable for menachos, for the meal offerings, right? Why would it be necessary to describe all the levels? So he says, in order to know which one is the greatest, that there's no one greater than it. Because why? One who wants to make himself more merititious, one wants to make himself better, one wants to do the best, he should yakuf es yitzray, he should subjugate his yetzer hara, his evil inclination, and he should bring his korban from the best. He should bring it from the most choicest and the best that there is, that's possible to bring, meaning that there isn't that kind of what he's bringing it. And he continues, it says in the Torah, that Hevel, if you recall the story right in the beginning in the book of Bereshis, where it describes that the 2 brothers each brought their korban, so it says, Vehevel hevi gam hu, and Hevel, he too brought from the choicest of his sheep, and from the superior ones. And what does it say? Vayisha Hashem el Hevel vel minchasai. And Hashem turned to Hevel and to his gift offering. Said then the Rambam continues, and he says, not only is this so when it comes to korbanos, but this same rule, this same principle applies to any time that someone is doing something for Hashem, that he should always do it from the most beautiful and from the best. And he gives several examples. If you're building a house of prayer, you're building a shul, it should be nicer than your own dwelling place. It should be nicer than your own home. If you're feeding the hungry, always feed them from the best and the sweetest, the tastiest from your table. If you are clothing the naked, you're clothing those who need to be garbed, you should always give them from the most beautiful of your garments. If you sanctified something, you consecrated something, hikdish davar, you should always consecrate it from the best of what you own. And as the Rambam concludes, it says, Kol chelev laHashem. The best always goes to Hashem. So this basically is the halacha that the Rambam brings at the end, towards the end of Hilchos Isurei Mizbeach. Now we need to understand, already in the beginning of this chapter, the Rambam already mentioned this idea, this requirement to always bring from the best. If you look actually in the very first paragraph, in the very first halacha of this chapter, he writes as follows: not everything that is not unacceptable could one bring. That means it's not just, okay, if it's acceptable, you can bring it. But rather, you should always try to bring from the choices, from the best. For example, let's say if one is obligated to bring a korban oila, he shouldn't just bring a sheep, a lamb, which, passes the mark because it's technically not a Baal Mum, but it's kachush, it is all weak, skinny, and ugly. You shouldn't suffice with that, but rather you should bring it from the very best. And the Rambam concludes, where did you learn it from? Where do we know it from? Because it says, Mifchar Nidarecha. In Chumash Devarim, in chapter 12, verse 11, it says that you should bring from the best, the choicest of your vows. Meaning you should always bring the best. So the question is, in short, this idea that you have to bring the best when you bring a korban, when you have obligation to bring a korban, or when you obligate yourself to bring a korban, this seems to be already something that we're aware of. In fact, the Rambam, as we just said, the Rambam himself mentioned it already. Why then does the Rambam feel a need to say it towards the end of these laws of what's forbidden for the Mizbeach? Towards the end of the laws, in other words, when he's wrapping up all the laws of the offerings of the Korbanos, and what does he add? What does he add exactly? And there's 3 points over here. He emphasizes all the different levels of the oil. Why is it important to know? They're just right. You need to give the choices. Why say this is better than that, and that's better than that, and this is higher than that, and this is an even higher grade? That's number one. Number two, the Rambam makes an emphasis that it has something to do with the person's desire to become more merititious. And finally, why does he bring proof from the story of Hevel and from the verse Kol Chelev LaHashem, when in the beginning of the chapter, remember when he mentions this idea, this concept for the first time, he brings it from an actual verse which says, the choicest of your promises, of your vows you shall bring. In other words, why does he need to resort to this proof? There's something here, there's something telling about it. The main questions, okay, if we have to say the main questions that could be asked here is, as we just did, okay, just to wrap it up, the Rambam draws a conclusion from this, from the idea of the Korbanos. He draws a conclusion to all the mitzvahs, right? He says, not only is this so when you are offering a korban to Hashem, either one that you're obligated in or that you obligated yourself in by means of making a vow, but rather the Rambam says it applies to all mitzvahs. If that's the case, why is it that the Rambam brings specific examples and very, very pinpointed ones, and specifically, why does he bring it here? If this is something which is not only applicable to korbanos, it's not only applicable to offerings, rather, like the Rambam says, like we just said, to all mitzvahs, then he could have brought it, he should have quoted this already much earlier in, for example, Hilchas Matnas Adniyim, where he discusses the laws of tzedakah, which is several books ago, or even before that, where he discusses the laws of prayer, which includes the laws of building a shul. So, if this is such a general thing, why did he wait for here? Why is this the choice place to bring out this concept and then to conclude that it belongs and it also applies to all the mitzvahs? Now, it would seem that the difference between the beginning of the chapter, of these laws, and the end of the laws, it can be explained away very easy, very, very, very simply. Because in the beginning, meaning in the first time the Rambam mentions this idea, this requirement of bringing the best, he is more focused on the chefza, the object of the mitzvah, and he's explaining to us what the object of the mitzvah. The object always has to be the best. And now you can argue that here, at the end of chapter 8, the focus is, as he says, if a person wants to be more merititious, the focus is on the gavra. That's what would seem to be the difference, and perhaps easy to explain, easy to answer away. Why the Rambam feels a need to mention it again, and why he mentions it in two separate places, because there he was talking about the mitzvah itself, and here he's speaking about the gavra, the person performing the mitzvah. However, the Rebbe says that is not what the Rambam is saying, because the Rambam himself negates this by bringing the proof from Hevel. If you look closely, when the Rambam brings the proof from Hevel, and he says, Vayisha Hashem el Hevel, that Hashem turned to Hevel, he also adds the words V'el min chasayin to his offering. If the whole objective was about the focus on the Gavra, the Rambam should have just quoted Vayisha Hashem El Hevel and just say, etc., V'goimer. But the Rambam doesn't do that. The Rambam makes a point to also quote the words Ve'el Merchasei. That means that over here the focus is not only on the Gavra, not only on the person performing the mitzvah, but rather on the Chefza, the actual mitzvah itself. So that's not a sufficient answer. So how do we understand it? So the Rebbe says the answer is as follows. There is an inherent difference between the general observance of mitzvahs and the offerings of a korban. You see, generally when you observe a mitzvah, the main objective, the main goal is the gavra. The person has an obligation to fulfill, and that obligation is fulfilled by means of performing the mitzvah, whether it's with this object, with that object. The person, however, is the main focus here. The things with which you do the mitzvahs become either, as we said in the introduction, a tashmish mitzvah, or even more than that sometimes, a tashmish of kedusha. The thing itself becomes a holy thing, like a pirat tefillin. But the object here is more than anything, not the thing with which the mitzvah is being done, but rather the person who is doing the mitzvah. He needs to fulfill his obligation. Whereas when it comes to korbanos, what is really the main goal? What is the full objective? That the thing itself should become, that means, let's say, the animal, whatever it is, should become holy. It becomes a thing that belongs to Hashem. Of course, there's also the Gavra. There's also the person that's doing this, that has, so to speak, an accomplishment here, that also gets the credit, and that gets the mitzvah, because he is the one who's consecrating it. He is the one who's doing it. But what is the real main objective? The total and absolute objective at the end of the day is the thing itself should become consecrated to Hashem. The thing becomes Hashem's. In simple words, let's just look at it in plain simple English. All other mitzvahs, once the mitzvah was accomplished with that thing, meaning, even if the thing becomes an object of holiness, you took a regular piece of skin, turned it into a pirat tefillin, and it became an actual holy object. But at the end of the day, as holy as it is, who does it belong to? Whom's is it? It's yours. It's the person's. Whereas a korban, an offering, after you do the mitzvah, or once you accomplish the full extent of the mitzvah, it becomes holy, and whom's is it? Who does it belong to? Now it belongs totally to Hashem. And this will explain the difference between the hidur mitzvah in general, the need, the obligation, the requirement to beautify every mitzvah that we do, which we learn out from Zeh Keli Van Veu, versus that which is mentioned in the Gemara, versus what the Rambam is talking about here, which is the idea of bringing your korban from the best and the most beautiful. You see, the idea of hidur mitzvah, of beautifying a mitzvah and doing a mitzvah from the best, is like the mitzvah itself. It's not about the object itself being the most beautiful. Rather, it's about the person himself, the person who needs to do the mitzvah, the person who is now fulfilling his obligation by means of this object, that the person should be most elevated, that the person should be most merititious. He has to enhance his performance of the mitzvah. Whereas the hidur in korbanos, the beautification of a korban, the idea of bringing the korban from the best, is not only about making the person better, about you beautifying yourself before Hashem, you being in your, so to speak, most pristine level that you can be by doing the best. But rather, this is actually a din. This is an object in the mitzvah itself. This is a gather in the din of korban. That the giving over, the kirva, the closeness, the thing giving over to Hashem, the thing that you're giving over to Hashem, the thing that you're now making, so to speak, Hashem's property, should be of the best. And now we can appreciate why the Rambam brings it at the end of Hilchas Yisurim Mizbeach. Not even in the beginning of Hilchas Korbanos, which precedes Hilchas Isurim Mizbeach. You see, because at what point does a korban become actually Hashem's? In other words, when a person consecrates a korban, he says, this animal is going to be a korban. It's still not fully and absolutely Hashem's, in a sense. Why? Because the person still has many steps of obligation that they have to do before it reaches the actual Mizbeach, before it actually goes up to Hashem. In other words, there's still some connection to the ownership of the person. The person has to see to it that it gets brought, that he has to lean his hands on it, then he has to get it slaughtered, and he has to get the blood collected, and the blood sprinkled. There's so much that quote-unquote belongs to the person. So it's as if it's still his. But when you put it on the Mizbeach, that is when it completely becomes Hashem's. That's when it becomes absolutely Hashem's, which is the idea of the korban. And now we can appreciate why the Rambam brings specific examples for mitzvahs, specific examples, very specific ones, different than the ones that they are quoted in the Gemara as examples for things that you need to do, that you need to beautify when you do a mitzvah, that you need to do above and beyond and go for the best. The Rambam has very, very specific examples. Because over here, the Rambam's talking about everything that's being done, quote unquote, for the sake of Hashem. That they become Hashem's. That they're being transformed from being yours to becoming Hashem's. Well, we understand. A house of prayer, a shul, is obvious. That is for Hashem's. It's entirely for Hashem. It becomes a holy place of Hashem. When you consecrate something, again, we understand you're consecrating for Hashem. It's becoming Hashem's. Even the two examples about feeding the hungry and clothing the poor, those who are naked, those who need clothing. It's interesting, the Rogatchover explains that tzedakah, the mitzvah of tzedakah, has two aspects to it. There's the aspect of mitzvah that there is in it, and there's aspect of kapora, of atonement. Now, what is really the main objective of kapora? What is really the main end goal of any type of atonement is that you become Hashem's, that you get close to Hashem's. In other words, the aspect of the mitzvah of feeding the hungry, of clothing the poor, is really ultimately about taking your money and making it Hashem's by means of giving it that person, and this becomes your kapara, and this becomes your connection to Hashem. So to conclude, we made a very strong connection between the Gavra aspect and the Chefza aspect, and this is highlighted when it comes to Karbanos. Remember, in a Karban, in an offering, there is the Gavra aspect, as we said. The Gavra, the person who's bringing the Karban, the person who needs to fulfill his mitzvah, his obligation to bring the Karban. But ultimately, what did we say the emphasis in the Rambam is? That there is the Chefza here. There is the object which becomes Hashem's. There's the object which really plays the greatest role here. In other words, the full and ultimate complete state of the holiness of the Korban, when it is the best Chefza that it could be, it is the best object that it could be, that contributes and becomes the reason, it becomes the catalyst for the true atonement for the Gavra. And this is how they both come together, and that's why the Rambam does mention the person, but he mentions it in a way that the main objective is the Chefza, the object. And now we'll appreciate why the Rambam chose this type of korban, this type of offering, to bring this example. Namely, a korban mincha, a meal offering. There are many other offerings, and the same concept applies. So why is it that he's highlighting it here by korban mincha, when it came to the various oils as it applies to korban mincha? The answer is because by korban mincha it says, as we said in the introduction, v'nefesh ki sakriv, and a soul that will bring its offering. Why? Because it's talking about somebody who has a feeling he's poor, he has nothing else to bring, he can't afford anything else, and he feels like he's giving his all. He's giving his all to Hashem. And the truth is that when he's giving his all to Hashem, and he realizes, he knows, he's aware, he's fully aware, that what he's giving, even though it's his all, it's really nothing. It's just a little meager meal offering. It's nothing. It really takes up any space on the altar. It's so insignificant. This brings him to a point which is really the highest level that one can be when one is giving themselves over to Hashem. This brings him to a point of greatest level of holiness because he has the ultimate sense of lowliness, the ultimate sense of bittul. He has the ultimate broken heart. And this is the ultimate in subduing the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, which is really the main purpose and objective in always striving to bring your mitzvah and always striving to give your mitzvah from the best. The Yetzer Hara doesn't want. He says, you can suffice with this. Just get, you can get by. It's fine. You did a nice job. And what is the idea of going above and beyond? Subduing the Yetzer Hara. Where do we see this the most? In the poor man who's bringing his Karban Mincha. Says the Rabbi, by one subduing the Yetzer Hara and bringing the best to Hashem, this becomes the, so to speak, the end, the completion of the whole idea of the Mizbeach. What is the purpose of the Mizbeach? As it says, that it becomes acceptable for the person. Hashem accepts it on behalf of the person. It becomes favorable, and that makes Hashem to atone to the person. As the Chazal tell us, the Mizbeach, it's Miziach, it chases away all the evil decrees. It also feeds the entire world. As a result of the Mizbeach, it brings sustenance to the world. And Umechavev, it makes the Jewish people cherished and beloved by their Father in heaven. And ultimately, it's Mechaper, it atones. And certainly when all this comes together, once the reason for why the Mizbeach doesn't physically exist with us is gone, meaning when we go and we subdue our Yetzer Hara and we accomplish this through our mitzvahs, and now the Yetzer Hara and his effect is gone, then of course we're all going to merit speedily to the coming of Mashiach and the rebuilding of the Mizbeach in the literal sense.